Hello and welcome to the State Historical Society of Iowa's Iowa Stories Lecture Series. My name is Hang Nguyen, and today we are honored to host Marilyn Brookwood. Please have your mics off throughout the talk. We will have a moderated Q&A session at the end, so please type your questions into the chat. This talk will be recorded and posted on our website at a later date. I'd like to thank Mary Bennett, Allison Johnson, and Charles Scott for their assistance today, and acknowledge the support of Emily McLean, Michael Morang, and Jeff Morgan in promoting this event. Marilyn Brookwood is a psychologist who has worked in public education and held an adjunct faculty position at the College of New Rochelle in New York. In 2008, she earned her third postgraduate degree in Harvard University's Mind, Brain, and Education program. Her work on the Orphans of Davenport is a landmark study in the field of eugenics, as she chronicles how a band of young psychologists in 1930s Iowa shattered the nature versus nurture debate and overthrew long accepted racist and classist views of childhood development. Please join me in welcoming our guest lecturer, Marilyn Brookwood.
Hello, and I want to begin today by saying it is a great honor for me to be able to give this talk at the State Historical Society of Iowa. And I want to especially thank Mary Bennett, the Special Collections Coordinator, for inviting me to speak with you, to Hang and is it Nguyen Hang, who gave me help with my book, and for discovering the photo that you see on the cover, and to Allison Johnson, who catalogs books and who agreed to help today. And I want to thank the whole book team that aided me in preparing for this gathering. It's been my tremendous pleasure to reveal the untold story of the Iowa Station, to discover how an obscure, unsung group of open-minded Iowa psychologists were the first to understand that environment changes young children's intelligence, and to have the chance to talk with you about all of this. The way I like to begin my talks is to spend a little time on two people essential to the story, but about whom almost nothing is known: Viola Hoffman and Cora Bussie Hillis. First, we'll hear a little bit about Hoffman's story.
A young woman who presented herself for indigent maternity care at Iowa City's University Hospital on May 7, 1934, appeared confused and gave the nurses 2 first names and 4 last names because she would not or could not say which were really hers. So hospital officials chose for her, and in Iowa's public record, she is Viola Hoffman. Hoffman could provide so little information about herself that her file did not include how far she had gone in school or even her age. As a matter of routine, the hospital asked women like Hoffman for permission to test their IQs. Because of her unfortunate mental state, it is hard to know whether Hoffman understood what an IQ test was, or that if she had a poor result, she might be institutionalized and sterilized. Although she consented to the test, she may have realized that with her low social status, she was in no position to refuse. This is how it happened that one day, for about an hour, Hoffman sat in a sparsely furnished hospital office with a psychologist who asked question after question, many containing concepts that in her condition she might have had difficulty grasping. For example, she was asked to consider contrasting ideas: the difference between laziness and idleness, between poverty and misery, character and reputation, and evolution and revolution. If she correctly answered 3 out of 4 of these, Hoffman's IQ would have been assessed in the average range. In another part of the test, she had to mentally compute arithmetic problems. In yet another, designed to test attention and memory, she had to repeat a series of 7 digits forward and then backward, and then do the same with another series and then another. Hoffman's test results of 66 indicated that her IQ was well below the average range of 90 to 109, and her diagnosis, moronism, became part of her official state of Iowa file. During this period, the terms moron, imbecile, and idiot were officially identifiers for individuals who IQ tests fit certain numerically low intelligence categories.
So let's talk a little bit about intelligence tests. You've just heard what happened to Viola Hoffman. Those tests became popular in the United States between 1910 and 1916. And they became tools in a mainstream public policy called eugenics. Eugenics was a crusade of believers who thought all human traits are biologically determined and inherited, and that problematic traits such as criminality, pauperism, epilepsy, insanity, promiscuity, and many others, all were the result of low intelligence. Anyone with these traits could be institutionalized and sterilized. But what eugenicists wanted was to improve the racial stock of the United States. They had an ideal. They wanted a society of the able. And let me say that the people who got sterilized and institutionalized were much more like Hoffman. They weren't people who were middle and upper middle class and upper class. A leader of the eugenics movement and of the psychologists who made IQ tests prominent was Louis Terman, the head of psychology at Stanford University. Terman and his peers claimed that IQ tests were scientific, and although psychology was a new profession, they became the experts in evaluating the intelligence of those who might be institutionalized or sterilized. By 1927, nearly all states had passed laws allowing this. It was thought that genetics accounted for the superiority of middle class and upper middle class white people. And when Hoffman asked to be sterilized, which she did, that was viewed as a benefit for society. Their idea was prune the withering branch of the genetic tree. Our reader will go on with her in July after Hoffman.
Right.
Okay.
In July, after Hoffman delivered a normal baby boy, whom she named Wendell, her mental status deteriorated further. Although she took care of her newborn son, she was unaware that she was his mother. Her hallucinations increased, and she stopped keeping herself clean. 6 weeks later, doctors diagnosed her as insane and committed her to Clarinda, an Iowa State hospital for the mentally ill. With his mother institutionalized, Wendell spent his first year in a Des Moines juvenile center. In the summer of 1935, when her son was 1 year old, Iowa declared Viola Hoffman cured of mental illness and released her to the care of a sister in Chicago. The state would have permitted Hoffman to resume custody of her son, but instead she chose to relinquish her parental rights. Officials therefore transferred Wendell, now a ward of the state, 170 miles east to the nursery at the Davenport Home, Iowa's principal state-run orphanage.
So Wendell Hoffman's story is a ribbon through the entire book, and I was very fortunate to come to know him and count him as a friend. He died in 2015, and I quote him and describe him a great deal. Now we'll move on to one of the most important persons in this book, a figure of immense importance to psychology, a powerful intellectual, an original thinker who changed the history of psychology, Cora Bussie Hillis. Let's hear about her.
Born in 1858, Cora Bussie Hillis was in her early 20s when her mother died, and she assumed the care of her disabled younger sister, who could not walk and was shut out of participation in many activities. Although doctors had little hope for her sister's recovery, Hillis searched for therapies to support her return to health and eventually helped her attend college and enjoy a productive life. From this lesson, Hillis, the daughter of a Civil War brigadier general and now married with her own family, became deeply interested in child welfare and development. When she tragically lost 3 of her 5 young children to accident and illness, Hillis recognized that, as with her sister, not even the doctors had the necessary information to keep young children healthy and safe. From that terrible awareness, Hillis defined her life's mission. the establishment of a center that would give the normal child the same scientific study by research methods that we in Iowa give to crops and cattle. To support her goal, Hillis began a search for scientific theories of child development. She was amazed not by what she found, but that there was nothing to find. I waded through oceans of stale theory written by bachelor professors or elderly teachers. I discovered there was no well-defined science of child rearing. There were no standards. All the knowledge was theoretical with no research basis.
So Hillis decided that she had a model for what she wanted to do, and it was the ubiquitous agricultural laboratories called stations. And she wanted to establish a station that would study children, so it would be able to be known by people in Iowa and elsewhere what a normal child needs for development. Nobody really could tell her that. That was her big idea. So let's go on with the reading about how she did that.
As she gained expertise and contacts, Hillis's mission became widely known. But when asked about her idea's origin, she would say, "Oh, it's in the air," what she called humble origins. She feared that if it were known that the concept came from a woman, it would not be taken seriously. But Hillis was an innovator. She had an idea no one before had considered, one she believed was God's work. In an effort to enlist advocates, she approached the University of Iowa, where 4 of its presidents barely heard her out before turning her down. One suggested that she apply herself to raising money for the campus carillon. Hillis also attempted to find support from the state legislature, but in nearly 20 years, just 6 legislators agreed to speak with her.
So Hillis may have said the ideas were in the air, but let me tell you, they weren't. She was the only one who had this idea, but she made it a part of her life and a mission of her life. And Hillis thought if she were alive, she was so innovative. If she were alive today, I think she would have been leading a Silicon Valley startup company. She convened a meeting of over 30 state organizations, including officials from Iowa's 11 congressional districts, contacts with newspaper reporters. She won endorsements from the superintendent of all of Iowa's public schools, the state's labor unions, the Federation of Women's Club. You see a picture on your screen of one of her meetings, of parent-teacher associations, Sunday schools, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Carl Seashore, a beloved figure at the University of Iowa, told her, he was the one person at the university who listened to her. He told her, "This is the psychological moment." Her blueprint also included the study of the orphans at the Davenport home, although that did not get underway for about 10 years until Harold Skills arrived. Let's go on with our reading.
By 1917, just as Hillis's proposal had reached the brink of approval from the Iowa legislature, the United States entered World War I. Anticipating that the state's funds would now go to the war effort, at the last minute her campaign was rescued when local newspapers headlined that, quote, only 41 of 250 Iowa young men were sound enough to go to war. Hillis immediately took those to the same newspapers to suggest that the rejected recruits had been brought up by mothers who relied on inherited traditions and the leadings of instinct because they lacked scientific information about how to raise fit children. Then Hillis placed a cartoon in the Des Moines Register advertising that Iowa spent more money on goats and hogs than on its own offspring. In response to that pressure, Hillis's bill finally was passed. Importantly, but without a lot of fuss, Hillis, Seashore, University of Iowa President William H. Jessup, Iowa State legislators, and Iowa's governors, along with 500,000 women's group supporters, had taken a stand on the side of environment's influence on development. Now chartered by the state in 1917, the Iowa Child Welfare Research Station finally opened for business.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our reader for today. So in the beginning, what was the Iowa station like? It was this house, and there were people who did research in education, in school environments, in family life, who wanted to look at health and what made for success and for healthy kids. They had no idea that they were going to ignite a battle with eugenicists. Slowly, they began to understand that they were creating new knowledge about nature and nurture. But that didn't happen quickly. They didn't start out with that determination or that idea in their minds. They never thought about it at first. So who were these amazing people? The leader was George Stoddard. Let me say, every one of the people I'm going to tell you about had a particular role and fulfilled it beautifully. And they all formed a kind of quartet where each person made a salient contribution. George Stoddard was from Carbondale, Pennsylvania. He was the first person in his family to ever go to college. He had an intellectual appetite that was almost insatiable. And while he was at college, he decided he wanted to know more about psychology. So unlike other American psychologists, people who wanted to be psychologists, he took himself to Paris, well, who didn't want to go to Paris, to the Sorbonne. And he didn't speak any French, and he introduced himself to somebody named Theodore Simon, who had worked with the recently deceased Alfred Binet. Alfred Binet was considered the most promising experimental psychologist in the world, actually, at that time. So Binet's, Theodore Simon told Stoddard, who was picking up French, that he could go into anytime he wanted, go into Alfred Binet's laboratory, and he could read all his papers. And that's what Stoddard did. He was a brilliant thinker. He could be intimidating. He was admired. He was feared sometimes. He was a deep lover of Iowa and of its university. It satisfied his intellectual hunger. He would have at his home Robert Frost, who was teaching in Iowa, and Grant Wood, who also was teaching in Iowa. And from Stoddard's exposure to Alfred Binet, he became an environmentalist. But it's important to note that he didn't push his ideas on anybody, not on anybody at the station. I mean, they knew what he thought, but there was no pressure to change what you think because this is what the director thinks. We all know that can happen, but it didn't happen there. So because of who he was, he attracted a great deal of financial capital from the Rockefeller Foundation's Laura Spelman Memorial. And there was a guy who was running that memorial. His name was Beardsley Rummel. And Beardsley Rummel was also a powerful intellect. Beardsley Rummel had earned his PhD by the time he was 23. Eventually, he became the president of the University of Chicago. And Beardsley Rummel could have given his money to anyone. A lot of psychology programs were after him. But instead, what he did was he gave the equivalent today of $14 million to the Iowa station. I mean, that made it, because now Stoddard had the money to support all of the research that the people who were working there wanted to do. So that was really pretty amazing. You know, by the way, I should tell you that eventually more psychology students went to Iowa to become PhD psychologists than any other college or situation in the entire nation. So George Stoddard made that happen. So it was the New Deal, it was Depression, and Stoddard got involved in promoting emergency nursery schools for all the states in the country. And those nursery schools were an incredible model for what we might need today. What they did was they gave to all children, so all children were needy in that time almost. and especially in some rural places where the Depression was even worse. And so what George Stoddard made happen was those kids got a hot meal every day. They got free medical care. They learned things. And also the schools employed about 5,000 or 6,000 women to be teachers. It was just an amazing accomplishment. He was so good at this stuff. The next person I want to talk about is Beth Wellman. She was also a remarkable figure, but in a completely different way than Stoddard. Where Stoddard was bold and talked to anybody and wanted to hear your ideas, Beth Wellman was quite shy. She was from Iowa. She was born in Clarion, Iowa. She had traditional thinking about children and intelligence. And she became engaged to the first director of the station, Bird Baldwin, who had been widowed. Just before they got married, they were to get married, Baldwin suddenly died. This was in 1928. And he died because he went for a shave and a barber nicked him. And, you know, it wasn't like today when we have antibiotics, and he never recovered. But what Beth Wellman did something nobody else had done also. What Beth Wellman did was she went over to the laboratory school that the University of Iowa was running, and she started testing children's intelligence there. And what she discovered, she didn't believe, because it was so different from what she had been taught. She, like every other psychologist, had been taught intelligence never changes. You get what you're born with, that's it, doesn't matter what else happens or what you do. So what she found was that children who were not in school in the summer, that their intelligence plateaued for that period of 2 or 3 months when they weren't in school. When they went back to school and she retested their intelligence later on in the year, she could see their intelligence going up. And finally, she published a paper in 1932 that said that children's intelligence that she was looking at gained by 10 points in 2 years. Well, that was ridiculous. No, everybody knew that couldn't happen. So she sort of went back over all of her records and data, and she couldn't figure out where she'd gone wrong. She figured she must have gone wrong somewhere, but really, the more she went over it, the more she realized it was everybody else who was wrong. So it was not only an amazing accomplishment for this young woman to have done this, but it became kind of an anchor at the station, because other people at the station were just beginning to see that intelligence actually could change. And when they said to themselves, well, I must be wrong, which is what they said, they thought about Beth Wellman. So she also found that if you went to school for a full day instead of for a half day, we're talking nursery school here, that your intelligence was higher. She also found that if you had gone to nursery school, this is a 1934 paper, if you had gone to nursery school and then went to take a college entrance examination, and remember, she was studying a data set that went back many years because she came in late, but this nursery school had been going on for a while. She found those students who had been in nursery school scored better on college entrance exams. They even had college entrance exams in those days. So Wellman was, these were the first indicators at the station that environment counted much in a way no one had conceived of. The next person we're going to look at and talk about is Harold Skeels. Harold is from Osage, Iowa. His father was a well-known evangelical preacher. His mother was the church organist. He trained at Iowa State in animal husbandry, so he learned all about breeding. His first job after college was to be a tester of the dairy fat content of milk because that was an indicator for the breeding of cows. And Harold could have gone on to a perfectly fine, very typical Midwestern Iowa profession and stayed with animal husbandry. And for reasons we don't know, because Harold didn't talk about his feelings much, Harold left animal breeding and went into the Iowa Station as a graduate student. And he became an expert in, guess what? IQ tests. So Harold, I said that Beth found this information in 1932 and 34. Harold was hired by the Iowa Station, not just after he got his PhD, and he became a researcher, and he was assigned to test intelligence in another Iowa institution called Glenwood. And he went to Glenwood because at Glenwood, everyone was retarded, and he was going to give IQ tests to all of these kids. And the strangest thing happened. He found kids at Glenwood with normal IQ, and they weren't supposed to be there. So he asked, what were they doing there? And he found out that there were judges in Iowa who had delinquent boys who didn't want to send them to schools for delinquents. And so instead, they sent them to Glenwood. But it was Harold's job to make sure that everybody was in their right place, and kids with normal intelligence didn't belong at Glenwood. So he moved them to Davenport, which was for normal children. Oh, well, that's interesting, isn't it? So he was amazed when there they were now at Davenport, and he kept testing their IQs. And you know what? Davenport was so deficient in its care of children that those children's IQs kept declining and they became retarded. One day, our friend Harold was talking with George Stoddard, and he asked him, how could this happen? I have, Stoddard reported that in an interview he gave, that Harold just didn't understand how that could happen. It just so challenged everything he was thinking. So that was a kind of a stumble into evidence that he never conceived of. But Harold had an even bigger stumble into evidence. Harold was working at Davenport, and he met and he tested two little children. They're known as BD and CD. And they're so famous, by the way, that a friend of mine who's a professor in Göttingen in the Netherlands just wrote me the other day. She said, I'm giving a lecture about BD and CD and your book. So here were these two little girls who were 13 and 16 months old, and they were retarded. They didn't turn over, they didn't follow sounds, they didn't try to speak. They were rocking in their cribs, and they didn't really have signs of being normal children at all. And if you took their intelligence, remember I said that, or we heard that a normal intelligence is about 100. If you added up these two little babies' intelligence, the total would be 81. So that's how retarded or low intelligence they were. And he just really didn't believe that they could be that low. And so what he tried to do was what he had to do as because he worked in Iowa and it was the rule, they couldn't stay at Davenport. They were so not normal. And he tried to find a place for them the right kind of a place for them to be, but it was the Depression. And so everything was very, very crowded. And the only place he could play, only place that would accept them was the Woodward Home in Woodward, Iowa, which was really a home for epileptics and adult retarded women and men, and for children who had medical problems. So he placed them there, but there wasn't any real room for them there. And so the people at Woodward, for reasons we have no idea of, placed these little girls into homes, into wards in which low intelligence women called morons lived. So here are these women, and they may have, by the way, had children of their own on the outside. Here are these women, and now they have these two little girls living with them. And they did something absolutely remarkable. They almost adopted them. So they played with them all the time. They toilet trained them. They taught them to speak. They took them places. They braided their hair. They asked the staff to buy things with the little money their families would have sent them. And guess what happened? Within about 8 months, these little girls had normal intelligence. Their intelligence revived under the care of people who were totally untrained, but just used their own experience and their sense of love. So that was an amazing thing. And Harold Skeel saw that, and so did Maurice Skodak. He didn't really understand it. So he decided to study these kids. And for a year, he kept observing them, and their intelligence just kept going up. And then he realized, oh my goodness, they can be adopted because their intelligence is so much higher now. If you were retarded, you were not permitted to be adopted. So Harold took them back to Davenport, and they were very soon adopted and lived in homes with parents and so on. He saw them later when they were adults, and the book talks about what they were like then. Did I mention that this was something that never happened at Davenport? These children, they toilet trained these kids. Nobody at Davenport ever toilet trained anyone. So you can imagine what that must have been like. This was the most exotic experiment, if you want to call it that. And what happened after that was that Harold got permission from the state of Iowa Board of Control to bring 11 more children to live with, quote, moron women, unquote. And guess what happened? The same thing. It repeated itself. Two of those kids had absolutely horrific early lives, and they didn't recover as much, but they recovered a lot. They didn't become normal. The other children all became normal and were adopted. Then the next person we're going to talk about today is Maurice Skodak. Maurice Skodak is from Lorain, Ohio. Her family emigrated here. She was born here, but her family emigrated here. Her family in Hungary had a lot of educators, and her father was an unusual guy, spoke 6 languages. He had been an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army. The other thing that happened to Maurice Skodak, she's a terrific student, and she became, she went to Ohio State University, which had a terrific psychology program, one of the best in the country. And her mentor there was someone who you may have heard of, Henry Goddard. Henry Goddard was one of the leading eugenicists in the country. And he wrote a book called The Kallikak Family, which is about some people in New Jersey, in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, excuse me, who Goddard claimed had 2 branches, one genetically very strong and the other genetically very weak. It's a very famous book. He got a lot of attention for it. And there's Maurice Skodak studying with him. She never doubted he was right. So Henry Goddard became her mentor. She decided to go on for her PhD at Ohio State. She won the most prestigious psychology fellowship that they had, and she went to Ohio State, but because of politics in the department, she decided to leave. She had worked for a summer with Harold Skeel in Iowa, and amazingly, he wrote to her, not knowing that she was ready to leave, And he wrote to her and invited her to come back to Iowa. And she said it was the best day of her life that happened. So there we have Marie Skodak and Harold Skeels working together with George Stoddard and Beth Wellman. And Marie and Harold are working in the Iowa orphanage itself. And their job is to test the IQs of the children there. And they noticed that in the adoptions that happened from Davenport Home, when the children were being adopted at very, very young ages. Why was that? Mostly in the United States, children weren't adopted until they were a year old, because the people who ran the adoption agencies wanted to see what kind of kids these were before they put them out into the world. But they didn't have time to do that at Davenport. It was overcrowded, and they had to get rid of these kids. And Harold and Marie didn't feel that way, but the guy who was running the Davenport home, he felt that way. And so kids came in and they went out. Babies went out. They were letting kids who were 2 months to 4 months old be adopted. No one else did that in the United States, and everyone looked down on Iowa's program for allowing that to happen. They thought these kids were just going to be, nowhere. So what happened? The state asked Harold and Marie to go and visit these kids when the kids turned to be about a year to 15 months old, just to make sure that everything was okay. So Harold and Marie were sure that when they did that, they were going to find that nothing was okay, and that they were going to have to remove children from the only families they had ever known, because their intelligence wasn't normal, and they were not allowed to leave children like that in an adoptive home. So Harold and Marie even developed a script for what they would say, how they would explain to these families who loved their babies and their children, how they would explain they had to remove them. In 4 years, 600 children, only 2 had to be removed. Why? Because what Harold and Marie found in those homes was children whose intelligence was normal. It was even more than normal. Many of those children were in the superior range with IQs of 114 to 116. And no one could understand that, especially not Marie and Harold. So how did that happen? They started to think maybe there's something else going on here, that the loving environment of these families with these children so promoted the intelligence of the children, that this was something they had just never predicted. So Harold described the children in an article an interview he gave as, these were the scores of children whose parents were college professors. That's how impressed he was by all of this. So when the people in Iowa started publishing all this information, the profession of psychology just couldn't believe it, couldn't grasp it, and attack them. Why did they attack them? First of all, psychology was a new profession, and these people had not had really good jobs until Lewis Terman came along and was promoting IQ tests. So now they were all working. If those tests were wrong and these kids were doing much better, what was going to happen to their jobs? And by the way, that affected Terman as well. He had a lot to lose. And all of these ideas that Lewis Terman had and all of American psychology had, all of these were eugenic ideas. So there's a photo we have called "This Light Flashes Every 15 Seconds." Can we get that one up? Yeah, there we go. Eugenicists they wanted to spread the word about how important eugenics was, and they had fairs. This was the 1926 Eugenic Fair. And I don't know if you can read that. This like flashes every 15 seconds. Every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded criminals, and other defectives. And actually the lights really flashed. And then there are these others. There were a lot of these kinds of billboards and signs at these fairs. In the early 20th century, eugenicists believed that children inherited all their traits, as we've said, and that these traits represented their race, their class, their nationality, and nothing could be changed or modified. Most repetitive testing of IQs was done under unchanging conditions. So where all of American psychology went off the rails was they were testing kids who were in first grade in this school, the next year, second grade in that school, living in the same families. Nothing changed for those children. And so actually they did get consistent IQ results. The reason the Iowa people didn't have consistent results and saw the things that they saw with Harold Skeels, for example, and with Maurice Kodak as another example, is they were using different environments. Those children's environments were not stable. The ones that Maurice Kodak tested, those kids were stable when they were placed. They remained in middle class and upper middle class homes in Iowa. They went to good schools. Iowa had great education opportunities for them, and their parents did pretty well. They weren't wealthy, but they did well. They were middle class, and those kids had stable lives and they had stable IQs. What Harold saw was when you took those kids B, D, and C, D, and the other kids, and you changed their environment from the destitution of the Davenport home and you put them into another situation, then their IQs changed dramatically. So that was really the key here. But the eugenicists didn't believe that, and they didn't know that. And by the way, neither did Harold and Marie realize that yet. And so there were better baby contests. Can I confess that my father in New York City, child of immigrants, won a better baby contest, and my grandmother one day when I was about 5 or 6 years old takes out this crinkly piece of newspaper and shows it to me, and it's my father's picture as the winner of some New York City baby contest. But eugenicists just didn't want to believe this stuff, and they said there's another photo to look at. How long are we Americans? Yeah, this is from another eugenics meeting. How long are we Americans to be so careful for the pedigree of our pigs and chickens and cattle and then leave the ancestry of our children to chance or to blind sentiment? This is how eugenicists really thought. They also thought they were representing a science. And in my book, I discuss what they thought that science was, how it came to be thought of as a science, why it took so long for them to understand that it wasn't scientific. But they also wanted these ideas to determine social policy. So there's another piece here that's more subtle. This was a time in the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, when things like Albert Einstein was working in physics and famous people were working in chemistry, and those people were getting a lot of attention. And eugenicists thought they had the same right to attention because they also were scientific. And so they should be treated in the same way. They never really got there, but they certainly tried. Then there's another part to eugenics. From 1880 to about 1920, 20 million immigrants arrived in the United States from Europe. And those people seemed unintelligent. They were assumed to be racially different, and they were assumed, because they couldn't speak English, to be stupid. In fact, we've already talked about Henry Goddard. Henry Goddard went to Ellis Island, where the immigrants came in on those ships, and he brought his IQ tests and his students, and they tested the IQs of these arriving immigrants and found really that they were stupid because, and low intelligence and ignorant because they couldn't speak English. How did they think about that? You'd have to explain it to me because I don't get it. So why is eugenics important to the story of the orphans? What the Iowans discovered contradicted the central cultural and political ideas of their time. They took on, and didn't mean to do that, it wasn't their plan, those ideas. And people who worked in institutions who had those ideas, you know, the people who ran the institutions, the matrons in the institutions, they knew the poor family histories of these children, and they just expected they would fail to thrive. Oh, they don't know how to go to the bathroom correctly. It didn't cross their minds, apparently. They have to be taught that and other things. So in the 1920s, biologists, and I don't want us to run out of time. In the 1920s, biologists discovered that environment changes the behavior of cells, and it changes the behavior of many animals. And you would think that the people in the United States and the world would have understood that this could affect the outcomes of education and family life, but they didn't. And so a lot of this is because people didn't pay attention to science, and psychologists didn't pay attention to science. Lewis Terman himself didn't pay attention to science, and he hated to do math, and he never studied statistics. So these very erudite research papers just were a way, not something they read. The only people who read them were the people at the Iowa station. So George Stoddard knew about them, and he told the people at the Iowa station about them. And so they began to understand that they were on to something very, very important. But there was a huge backlash against the Iowa people at this time. And they were berated, humiliated, attacked literally at every meeting they went to. You'll read about that in the book. And their results contradicted all of the current experts in psychology, and nobody would believe them. And you can imagine what that did to their careers. I see it's 10 of. I could go on and talk a little bit more about the Iowa research, but I also want to leave time for questions. So what do you think we should do here?
Go ahead and give us another few minutes, Marilyn, about the research center.
Okay, so here's a little bit more about Lewis Terman and his, this is a picture of Lewis Terman. He took over the Department of Psychology at Stanford. He built it into one of the most admired departments in the country, and he was convinced he was right about eugenics. He committed a basic thinking error. He drew causal conclusions from correlational findings. He thought what he saw around was right and that it reinforced his ideas. And he really invented the IQ test, developed the IQ test in order to have the intelligence numbers and test scores that would allow cities and hospitals to put people into institutions. that was his goal. You'll read about that in my book too. His goal was a eugenic goal. He saw intelligence testing as a beacon for eugenics, and he says that outright. He berated the Iowans' research. He said one day in a talk that he gave, to think that the cure for those children was carried out by moron nursemaids. And he coined that phrase, moron nursemaids. And for many years, this study, in fact, the first time it was ever described to me by a very renowned biologist, this biologist said to me, oh, that's the moron nursemaid study. So that's how it was thought of. He was not well trained. IQ tests were based on his ideas, and his test made him very wealthy. But he had a lot to lose if the Iowans were right. And by the way, they were. He had a hard time accepting personal criticism, and he always went on the attack. If anybody disagreed with him, he humiliated them publicly. He would humiliate them at meetings, and he would humiliate them in print in his attacks. And also his profession felt threatened, as we've already said. Harold Skeels, on the other hand, felt that by doing this work, maybe he was casting himself out of the profession of psychology. Then there was a revival, and in the 1960s, it began to be realized that maybe the Iowa people were right. And so money was given to them to go around and find the adults. Remember those 25 children from Davenport? They found every one of them as adults. One had died, but they found the rest. And they were amazed. These kids they were now young adults. Every one of them had achieved excellent life. They were working. Even the two that didn't become completely normal, they were working, they had jobs, they had communities, they had, the ones who married had children. It was just absolutely amazing. And Skeels was thrilled. But the thing that wasn't so amazing was Skeels also had this group of children who stayed at Davenport, who were never adopted. And those children declined. 4 of them wound up in institutions. They all wound up working in the lowest rungs of society, making very little money. And this was heartbreaking because Skeels felt that anyone in the first group could have been in the second group. Those groups could have been reversed, and their life paths would have been exactly different from what they were. But Skeels and Skodak finally were honored by the Kennedy Foundation because the Kennedys were very aware of low intelligence children. Eunice Kennedy, especially, in the Kennedy family, they had a sister, Rosemary, who was retarded. So we have a picture, I think, of, here. So this is a good place to conclude. This wonderful smiling man is Louis Branca, one of those children who was at Davenport and who was sent to Glenwood to be cared for by the women and who thrived. He became a university administrator, and in his hand, he's holding the award that was bestowed upon Harold Skeels, and Maurice Kodak also had one. And before Skeels died, he sent it to Louis. And I was in Louis's home, and I took this picture of him. So it's really very remarkable. But I also want to tell you just one more quick thing, and that is none of this happened with any awareness of what changes environment does in the brain, except now we know that, because here we've had evidence from someone named Charles Nelson, who studied the orphans who were living in institutions in Romania. And Chuck Nelson got money from the MacArthur Foundation. He set up a lab in Bucharest, and he did a randomized control study of kids who were in foster care and kids who were left in the institution. And he saw the differences in their brains. He could see what happened to the development of children who did not have care and attention and involvement and love and stimulation. So that's the talk for today. There's so much more. I could talk for another 5 hours, but you don't want me to do that. So
That was so excellent, Marilyn. Wow. There's so much more I want to learn. We are going to run over a few minutes, and that is fine. So if anyone needs to leave, feel free to do so. It's not a big deal. We have some questions that I'm going to ask now. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention that we are so grateful that Marilyn did research here at the State Historical Society of Iowa. She used the Cora, Bussie, Hillis papers that we have here in our archive. And she also used the records of the Child Welfare Research Station at the University of Iowa. So we love seeing our collections put into use. And then Hang, if you want to go to the last slide, we encourage people to purchase the book or read the book. And there are many more rich stories in the book that we didn't have time to talk about, or she didn't have time to talk about today. So with that, I'm going to ask some questions. Let's see what we have here. Our first one. Okay. Were there any controversies then or now in reflection in regard to the intelligence assessment of children of different races, genders, cultures, or religions?
That's a wonderful question. First of all, at that time, there was less than 1% of Iowa where there were Black people. But there was an orphan who came to Davenport who was, as he was described, whitish. That's the word. And he was given to a peddler family who were Muslim or had been Muslim, but were now part of a Christian church in Iowa. And that family had him for a few months, and then word got out that he'd been given to them, and they wanted to take him away. And they did. And the reason they took him away was this difference in the races that they perceived.
I see.
That person, when Harold found him, he was in an institution. He just didn't survive. They left him in Davenport for a while. Then he went to another, he became really almost schizophrenic. Harold thought that happened because of the neglect, but really schizophrenia is a very, very complicated diagnosis. So we don't really know that. But that story's in the book.
Okay. I noticed that you said that at one point you were saying that Iowa was the only state that was allowing those early adoptions, and I was just wondering why.
Because people in adoption agencies were convinced that you had to have older children in order to see what their intelligence might be, or if they had any other kinds of problems related to who they were or who knows what.
Okay.
But they kept them till they were about a year or two in an institution or in an orphanage, that they would know more about them. So what turned out to be completely against all the practice in the United States, also it gave Marie Skodak this amazing opportunity to test all these children. And it was what she found, she could hardly believe.
That's amazing. Okay, so let's see. Oh, how would one test the intelligence of a 13-month-old baby?
That's a really good question. How does one do that? So there are a couple of ways. In the time of the Iowa studies, they used something called sort of markers of development. Does this child try to talk? Does this child look at you? If you ring a bell, will it turn its head? If you give it something to play with, will it play adequately? These were just sort of milestones, but it's not really a test of intelligence. Today, they have developed more ways of doing that. I don't know. I myself am I'm rather dubious about this,
Sure.
but
That's interesting.
You can see, if you've seen 100 kids who are
Yeah.
2 months old or 100 who are 6 months old, you know pretty much where they should be. And if they're not, then that raises a flag and people.
Okay. 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 So was there much discussion of the ideal placement for children, like for instance, like rural versus urban, or how how they would find families? And then a second question, was there any effort to find families to adopt children of color?
There was no effort to find families to adopt children of color because in my research anyway, the story I just told you about this little boy is the only story that came up.
Okay.
And nothing else was ever mentioned. And efforts to adopt children in any other ways just weren't mentioned. This was a primitive time. It's not like today where we know so much more about development and
Right.
about racism. And we're all working to be the kinds of people we want to be, so that those things don't get in the way of our relations. And but it was not that way, not in Iowa anyway.
Sure.
So,
There's a couple questions that have to do with the fact that Iowa has been a leader in testing for children, like such as like the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, the ACT. How would you say that relates to the IQ tests? And then somebody else kind of had a question about, like, they've changed the trend to do admissions tests for college. Do you think that that's based on Iowa tests or our research?
I think it's based on an awful lot of cultural issues right now.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think that the problem with IQ tests is no one can define what an IQ is. There's no definition. There's no acceptable definition among any psychologist. In fact, at a meeting I was at some years ago, somebody said to me, Marilyn, just what is IQ? And I said, it's whatever's being tested on the test. And this guy looked at me and he said, that's exactly what my professor at, I forget where, told me. I said, that's what it is. We don't know what intelligence is. If you read Howard Gardner, he has, and other people, he's not original here, have ideas that intelligence is multifaceted and expressed in many different ways. And that's my belief. I don't think anyone can really tell you what intelligence is. And by the way, just to tell you where the science is right now, there are about 1,000 genes that affect intelligence. Every one of those genes is influenced by the external environment that the person perceives and by the internal environment of the physiological body. And just do the math. I mean, how do we know what's going on? It's
that's
possible.
It's a lot to think about. Okay, someone's asking a question about the photo on the cover of the book. Do you have the date? I know we could look at the book, but if you could just share with us any data about that.
I first found this photo, and then Hang found a much better version of it on a pamphlet published in 1901 by the person whose name was, I'm going to tell you his name. It was T.T. Gass. That's his name. And he was then the superintendent of Davenport. And he was trying to let the public know what a wonderful place Davenport was. And if you read that, and you can see it on the internet probably, you'll know Davenport in those days really was wonderful. It was the Depression that caused a lot of the issues we're talking about, but it was also eugenics. So that's where that picture comes from.
What time period do you think that was taken in?
1901.
Okay, great.
You can see the kids. Look at the kids. They're all dressed up and they're standing at attention, and the boys have these little caps, and the different age groups are there, and the girls are wearing little calico dresses. Look, it's adorable, And if you read this booklet, this guy just loved being at Davenport, and he thought it was the best home for kids who didn't have a home, and there they were. So they did this as an advertisement.
Okay. All right. So the very last question I'll ask is, I think, is it the little girls, the BD and CD? Are those? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know how old they were when they were adopted?
Yes, they were about 4 years old,
Okay.
between 3 and 4 when they were adopted. And BD did wonderfully. She really had wonderful parenting. BD's mother, when she talked to Harold Skeel, said that she had been adopted herself. And she grew up in a place called the Home for the Friendless. And it makes you cry.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that if she could, she'd adopt another child. CD wasn't as lucky. CD's parents both died when she was a teenager. And she also had serious asthma and had to drop out of school. There were no treatments then, had to drop out of school. But she married, moved out west with her husband, who seemed like a lovely guy. They had 2 children who had normal intelligence. So it worked out for her, but it wasn't as simple a story as
Okay.
we.
Well, great. All right. Well, I just want to thank you again for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure we all enjoyed it. So I can't wait to read more of the book.
And I want to thank you for inviting me and letting me talk at length about some. Maybe
Oh, you did an excellent job. All right. Well, we'll be signing off. Thanks everyone for joining us. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.